and today I am going to tell you a story. The name of this story is Little Miss Bossy and it is written by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Bossy is very bossy. She is one of the bossiest people in the whole world. She is also very rude. Like the time when she met Mr. Sneeze. Achoo! Sneezed Mr. Sneeze. Stop sneezing! Ordered Miss Bossy. I can't, achoo! Can't help it, said Mr. Sneeze. Nonsense, said Little Miss Bossy and walked off. Or the time when she met Miss Chatterbox. Good morning. Perfect weather, isn't it? Just the right time to go for a walk. Speaking of the weather, oh shut up, said Miss Bossy. Or the time when she met Mr. Small. She fell over him. You're so small. Grow bigger, ordered Miss Bossy. I can't, said poor Mr. Small. Well then, never come near me in the future, ordered Miss Bossy. Poor Mr. Sneeze, poor Miss Chatterbox and poor Mr. Small. But it was Mr. Small that decided that something had to be done about Miss Bossy. So he went to Little Miss Magic about it. When he told Little Miss Magic about all his problems, she said she had an idea. She said she knew how to stop Miss Bossy from being so bossy. So the next day, when she saw Little Miss Bossy coming down the street, Little Miss Magic quietly hid behind a bush. Little Miss Bossy came down the street and saw Mr. Greedy. She said, "You're so fat! Lose some weight!" Poor Mr. Greedy. But Miss Magic saw all of this from her hiding place. She crept out of her bush and muttered some very magic words. Abracadabra, abracadabra, abracadabra. Turn Miss Bossy very fat, she said and hid again. And you won't believe what happened to Miss Bossy, but let me show you. She is very funny. Mr. Greedy began to laugh. Look at yourself. You called me fat. You ought to take a look. So Little Miss Bossy looked at herself and she was lost for words. Again she went down the street. Miss Magic quietly followed her. As she went into Mr. Cheerful's house, Miss Magic climbed into Mr. Cheerful's chimney and hid over there. Miss Bossy saw Mr. Cheerful painting pink stripes all over his house. Why? Well, of course, to make it look more cheerful. Little Miss Bossy came in and said, "Paint over those horrid stripes at once. They look horrible," she said. Poor Mr. Cheerful didn't feel cheerful at all. Miss Magic came out of her hiding place and muttered some very magic words. Abracadabra, abracadabra, abracadabra. Paint Miss Bossy with very pink stripes, she said, and she hid again. And you won't believe it, but something very funny happened to Miss Bossy. Just let me show you. Look at her. Isn't she really funny now? So Mr. Cheerful saw her and began to laugh. "Ho ho ho, ho ho ho, you called my house bad? You ought to take a look at yourself," he said. And Miss Bossy looked at herself and for the second time that day, she was lost for words. Again, she went down the street, Miss Magic quietly following her. Miss Magic hid behind a tree when Miss Bossy went near Mr. Small. I thought I told you to get out of my way in the future. Peep squeak, she said to Mr. Small. Little Miss Magic saw all of this from behind the tree and muttered some very magic words. Abracadabra, abracadabra, abracadabra. Turn Miss Bossy into the size of an ant, she said and hid again. Little Miss Bossy began to shrink. She got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And Mr. Small began to laugh. I'll tell you why. Look, she became so small, she was even smaller than Mr. Small and even smaller than a worm. Mr. Small laughed. You called me a peep squeak. Look at yourself. Little Miss Bossy looked at herself, and for the third time that day, she was lost for words. Little Miss Magic came out of her hiding place and picked her up. Well, I see you haven't learnt your lesson yet, she said. Miss Bossy said, so it was you who did all those mean tricks on me. Turn me back to my right size at once. Not until you say the magic word, said Miss Magic. Abracadabra, abracadabra, said Miss Bossy. No, that's not the one I was thinking of, said Miss Magic. Now, I'm sure all of you know what word Miss Magic was thinking of, but it took Miss Bossy a little longer to figure it out. But when she thought for a while and figured it out, she said, fine, police. Miss Magic waved her wand and turned her back to her right size at once. And now, Miss Bossy is as bossy as ever, but at least she says please. And now that leaves only one thing to say. Please subscribe.